And thank you for staying for coming to this session. Before I actually start with my paper, I wanted to say just a few words on this topic and contextualize it a little bit. To say how did I even came to choose this topic, what I think is important, and to say a few words about a very interesting project. From one hand, it's important to mention this project, and from the other hand, I think perhaps you will find it useful, so I will say a few words about that as well. I will talk about some specific aspects that I dealt in my doctoral research. And I decided to focus on these very specific ambivalences and contradictions, or perhaps more precisely, ambivalent relationship between organizations, between different processes, different practices, different discourses, even of aid, within what I call the refugee aid workscape. So what do I mean by this refugee aid workscape and why I think is important? First of all, my idea was to emphasize the notion of work and the notion of labor within humanitarianism, not only because I worked as an aid worker, as a humanitarian, as an activist. I was engaged as an employee and as a volunteer in different organizations that work with migrants and refugees. But also humanitarianism has been largely and dominantly, and this is really important, addressed from either the biopolitical critique, for example, that I will touch upon briefly later on, or it has been criticized because a form of foreign aid that is in a quite a tight alliance with military interventionism, so in the liberal interventionism, so the way it was kind of co-opted and was used as some sort of a justification for state-based or military intervention. But also it was somehow important for me to emphasize the notion of work because of the things that I know that I went through and a lot of my colleagues. So when I started working in academia 4.5 years ago, I was employed on a project called Transformation of Work in Post-Transitional Croatia. And I was thinking, what kind of contribution can I make? And so I decided to choose this, if we might say, like non-conventional or some sort of marginalized form of work and form of labor within this global regime of labor. And I will be presenting today a lot of ethnographic examples and some empirical evidence on what this work actually entails and how the workers I talked to address the notion of burnout, taking into account all these ambivalences and tensions within this area. And as I finished my dissertation last year, I kind of continued this work on a project called European Regime of Irregularized Migration at the periphery of the EU, from ethnography to keywords. And if you have some time and some interest for this topic, please do check our ERIM. So it is an online platform, an online network of keywords. It is a network because you can also find on map where these keywords are, why are they related to a certain space or a certain place within the map. But also I know we mentioned yesterday as well, the relationship, between how can we and can we, how important it is to contextualize, to take this regional approach into account, and how can we address some specific, and it can be quite particular, empirical evidence and kind of related to this macro, global, and the theoretical level. So what we do is that we we write keywords that are coming from below, and then we either invent new, let's say, concepts or relate them or try to reconceptualize, if that's not a too strong word, the existing theoretical concepts within the area of this migration regime, because what's happening at the Balkan route and what's happening at this periphery of the European migration regime is quite important, and it has been kind of not represented to a large extent until we might say this project. So let me now start with the paper I prepared for you. So I'll start with an ethnographic example, sort of a vignette to show you, to open ethnographically some of these tensions and ambivalence that I experienced. So in the summer of 2020, I met a former colleague, an employee of the Croatian Red Cross at the time. We knew each other from fieldwork in refugee camps in Croatia and collaborated on a project during my employment with an international humanitarian organization. A few years into my PhD journey, I asked if he would be interested in an interview, which he quickly accepted. Conducting an interview with a person I already knew and talking about experiences we were both involved in. Only this time we were talking about it from different positions, that of a researcher and an interlocutor, was a somewhat challenging experience, not only in methodological or ethical terms. In addition to the fact that research participants were also my former colleagues or friends, a rather salient discomfort followed these conversations, especially in situations in which I did not agree with their opinions, or even sometimes because of fear, to use Kernigov's words, that I'm somehow dooming a progressive human rights project. Situated at the intersection of critical migration studies, anthropology of humanitarianism, and anthropology of labor, like I said, my research dealt with effective labor performed by aid workers that were providing humanitarian care for refugees and people on the move, which meant that a significant number of interviews addressed the notion of burnout, much more than what I had expected at the beginning. The latter interlocutor, whom I will call Danko, emphasized that he even enrolled in a postgraduate program for psychosocial support and that therapeutic supervision is still undermined and underrepresented in the humanitarian sector, according to his opinion, at least in Croatia. In an attempt to relate to what I interpreted as taxing experiences of the aid industry, during the interview, I reflected on my own burnout, using an example from the Winter Transit Reception Center in Slavonski Brod, a refugee camp that operated during the migration transit in Croatia in 2015 and 2016. As the problems I encountered can be underlined by overly bureaucratized and hierarchical humanitarian business, I shared, with him the story of how going to the field, even after my working hours or in addition to my regular job duties, which meant waiting for the train and having interactions with people, with refugees that were crossing through the camp, because my job was 90% related to a more administrative position, how these experiences helped me to maintain the meaning and the purpose I had initially attributed to this kind of work. However, contrary to my expectations that Danko will relate to my struggles, he reacted by saying, that is a problem then, that is the problem. He continued, this is the problem. Just as there are moderators at conferences, meetings and such, there should be a serious coordinator or someone in the field who will tell you, I understand you, I see you, I hear you. And also, you have to get some sleep because tomorrow you are useless in the field. And besides, you are not in this rotation. This is how they called, the shifts of a couple of days. So with the need to justify, perhaps naively to justify my actions, but also to lessen the discomfort I felt, I added that this is a matter of organizational and power relationships specific to that work, and that I was kind of coordinating a part of the program, etc., to which he replied, this is an even bigger problem. So according to Danko, this was a wrong approach that contributed to my burnout. So in addition to what I understood, at least partially, as this psychologization of my reaction to what I saw as a disturbing realization of subjectification of refugees to the regime of care and control, Danko's comment was situated within a framework of this late capitalist, neoliberal, and perhaps we might say a corporate regime of work, under the hegemonic imperative of managerialism, characteristic to post-40s neoliberal ideologies of work. The emphasis was placed on keywords such as good leadership or the effective team organization, but also on the overall division of labor, in which, according to him, the specific contribution of each worker and member of the team should be recognized as an important step towards accomplishing a common goal. So he believed that good aid work can be done in accordance with traditional principles of humanitarian actions that have been largely criticized and contested, like impartiality, neutrality, universality, and so on, but with a considerable amount of compassion and mutual respect. So despite the justified need to professionalize humanitarian work, which I also somehow experienced as an imperative need, and I can explain later why, a common understanding among a large number of aid workers, specifically, not exclusive, but mostly the ones who were employed by large-scale national or international agencies. So like a common understanding in relation to structural and political inequalities, which create crises and lead to mass displacement, or even a reflection of their own positionalities within these global relations of power, was rather scarce or obscured and ignored. Recently, a more popular focus on self-care intensified this problem, leading to aid workers' detachment from the people they are trying to help. So this perspective nurtures this sort of a habitus of a disciplined international professional, the one that is effective, that knows when and how to properly care for himself, but is essentially alienated from the context he works in. In accordance with the imperative of entrepreneurial self, a compassionate humanitarian professional needs to optimally balance his personal and professional life. So he is required to be dedicated to his work, to the cause and to the mandate of his employer, but still maintain a healthy distance, or what Lisa Malki described as affective neutrality, or in the words of Anna Effector, to nurture some sort of an emotional comfort zone. However, in this paper, I want to address another angle of this problem. So most of the workers I talked to did not have, including myself, did not have extensive experience or knowledge when it comes to work in humanitarian crisis, while resources in terms of psychotherapy were unavailable, or when available, they were seen and sometimes forced and superficial, and seen also as a way of satisfying a certain project requirement. I mean, not only seen, but this happened, I will explain also later. I will give you an example later. In addition, despite the fact that burnout was mentioned in almost every interview, there seemed to be a strong correlation between, or perhaps a stronger correlation with burnout and the rights-based or politically more engaged and more mindful variants of humanitarian work, which was, of course, related to the lack of resources, the lack of support, some sort of institutional knowledge, etc. So it is a known fact that the NGO sector has a high staff turnover, while the former and particularly informal conversations with employees underline the problem of mobbing and toxic working culture, which is also a recent buzzword together with burnout. Namely the temporality of humanitarian actions, as well as the transformation of NGOs that occur under the pressure of competitive and restrictive donor and or state policies, creates unpredictable and precarious working conditions. Therefore, contrary to the image of this self-controlled and, in post-Foucauldian terms, self-managed, compassionate professional, the refugee aid workscape in my research was largely characterized by precarious, overworked, and burned out activists. So there's this ambivalence, right, between the distant self-managed professional related to masculinity, rationality, and so on, and the overly emotional activist or volunteer related to femininity or the private sphere. So the one who takes things too emotionally has little or no relevant experience with crisis management and cannot handle allegedly, right, work in stressful situations. This kind of ambivalence mirrors also the process constitutive of humanitarianism. At one hand, we have the depoliticization of suffering, of migration, and of humanitarian work. And on the other hand, the repoliticization of humanitarianism and migration and humanitarian work, or even recently in a recent text by Sandra Mezzandra, recognized as a radicalization of humanitarianism. So my research was looking specifically into the way these tensions appear in refugee aid workscape, the ways they affect and determine the nature and the type of labor invested by aid workers, and consequently the meaning that these workers ascribe to burnout in relation to these tensions. So, described as the business of saving lives, a form of government, or to use the definition by Peter Redfield, a moral concern that serves as the point of reference and negotiation for a wide range of actors, NGOs, social movements, corporations, states, and military forces. Humanitarianism encompasses different renditions of aid that nevertheless share, I quote, the common vocabulary of apprehension over suffering in human life. So depoliticization is frequently discussed in humanitarian studies as a means of reducing aid recipients, or in this case, refugees and people on the move, to mere bodies, passive and preferably docile subjects of aid who are incapable of taking care of themselves. In addition to the biopolitical understanding of aid, the principle of neutrality favored in humanitarian action, together with the prevailing neoliberalization of moral sentiments, enforces depoliticization of humanitarian actions. This is, for example, specifically evident in prioritizing technical solutions to political problems, or even framing emergency actions as political, although humanitarian actions is, as widely known, is intrinsically not democratic, but extraordinary and contingent. Repoliticization, on the other hand, refers to actions that approach humanitarianism from a politically more mindful or more engaged perspective. So here, the notion of political is understood as a process of calling into question or disrupting order created and maintained by a set of practices we generally recognize as politics. So a common example would be independent rescue operations in the Mediterranean, organized despite legal restrictions or state attempts to criminalize such actions, or the distribution of humanitarian assistance to undocumented people on the move and rejected asylum seekers, also recognized in Belgium as subversive humanitarianism, whose aid is not covered by formal and or state-sponsored humanitarian programs. So in the Croatian context, among the examples of such actions would be the work of grassroots groups and civil society associations that, in addition to providing legal and humanitarian aid, have a strong emphasis on advocacy work, or the ones that refuse, for example, financial support from the EU and the related states-based donors. So they don't want to be funded by the donors that directly or indirectly participate in the practices of the European border regime. So rather than posing as distinct and separate areas, these two processes appeared in my research as an ongoing negotiation, an ambivalent relationship, which they simultaneously complement and oppose each other, thus illustrating what Didier Fassin described as the aporia of humanitarian governmentality, a profound contradiction, how he defines it, between the noble goals of humanitarian action and the concrete terms under which humanitarian agents have to operate. So I will share a few ethnographic and empirical examples as a depiction of these aporias of the Croatian humanitarian regime while addressing experiences of or the meanings attributed to burnout. First example is related to pathologization of this experience or sort of an affective or political response or effective response to politically disturbing situation, we will see. So when the mass refugee transit was stopped in the spring of 2016, a group of people was stranded in the refugee camp in Slavonski Brod. At the time, no one knew if the camp will close or, you know, what will happen next. So the Ministry of Interior decided to keep stranded refugees locked in one of the sectors of the camp, preventing all aid organizations, apart from the Croatian Red Cross, of entering that area. Only after a few weeks of negotiation, the MOI reluctantly enabled all organizations access to detained refugees, but of course conditioning their work, insisting that they deliver a formal description of their activities, kind of, you know, surveilling their work and allowing them to stay there for only a few hours a day. My interlocutor, Amir, an Arabic interpreter that worked in this camp, referred to the actions of the organization he was employed with at the time with regard to their relationship with the MOI. Namely, as the authorities of the camp try to intimidate humanitarians, claiming that they will be banned from the camp if they do not follow the imposed restrictions, most organizations try to keep like a favorable relationship with the authorities and maintain someone neutral and diplomatic position within the hierarchy of the camp. So the prevailing opinion was that the most important thing was to stay in the camp, to, you know, maintain the position, even if this meant turning a blind eye to problematic practices such as arbitrary detention, deportation, acts of political violence, etc. So the experiences shared by Amir represent a blatant example of disappointment and dissatisfaction with humanitarianism's principles, but also with the treatment he was exposed to by his employer. So he was frequently asked to calm his temper, to refrain from expressing his opinion, and was eventually suggested to visit a psychologist who told him that he should be more flexible and sometimes let things go. However, he believed that incarcerating people without any explanation is a violation of human rights, and that the fact that an organization mandated to protect the rights of children should not even come close to the fence of the sector of this closed area, or ask the police for information about the number of children, the condition, etc., is not, I quote him, is not a flexibility but a farce. When the organization finally gained access to closed parts of the camp, Amir was the only employee who was forbidden from entering during the first couple of days, most likely due to a complaint made by one of his colleagues to the organization's management. He says he was on the blacklist, and he singled out the following situation as one of the reasons. So because I once reacted to a policeman, not physically, but I didn't allow violence against one woman to continue, they reported me to the MOI that I reacted against the policeman, that I almost reacted physically towards him. I did because he reacted physically towards this woman, which was not okay with me. The only power you have, at least, is to push him not to continue the violence. So later, when he finally got access to the sector, one of the coordinators warned him to focus only on work in the area for children, and if necessary, on translation, and not to pay any attention to anything else. He then asked, what should he do if he saw a man trying to commit suicide or some sort of, similar crisis situation. And we had several attempts of suicide in the closed areas. He says, I quote, that I have nothing to do with it, that I just go in straight and enter the playroom, igraonica, so like the area for children, and that's it. And so the coordinator replied that their job concerns only women and children. She said, you simply go inside the playroom, you draw, and you play. So interpreting Amir's comments through the lens of psychotherapy, especially because he himself is originally from Syria, so there was an assumption among the coordinators that it was more difficult for him than for the other workers, mirrors the humanitarian regime's tendency to pathologize political protest, or in this case, like I said, the political impulse with the realm of aid work, or some sort of effective response, natural response to a politically disturbing situation, and characterize it, to use Foucault's vocabulary, as a form of madness. So this was used not only to discipline workers to fit into the role of obedient humanitarians, but to enforce the functioning of the migration regime while framing it as this effective division and specialization of work in accordance with the mandate's organization. So now I'll share another example that has more to do with civil society association, the one that has this position of like a grassroots or, actor of repoliticization. The groups that unfortunately are also caught in the web, and faced with very, very similar dilemmas and problems. And I think this is very, very particular to the humanitarian area. And I think this is something also that will be interesting for discussion. So another example has to do with the reflections of an informant about working in the civil society sector and helping the family of Madina Husseini. Probably many of you have heard about Madina Husseini. She was a 6-year-old girl who was hit and killed by a train during a police pushback from Croatia to Serbia. She was helping the family in filing lawsuits, first at the Croatian courts, then at the European Court of Human Rights. And as many of you know, pushback refers to an illegal and forced return of people on the move, usually done by the police and state authorities with little or no administrative record. Importantly, violent pushbacks have been happening at the Croatian borders extensively since 2017. So despite the long-awaited verdict of the European Court of Human Rights that finally last year, I think, ruled that Croatian authorities violated the rights of the child, my interlocutor, whom I will call Lara, worried about what was happening to the Husseini family while waiting for the final decision, filing indictments, and exposing themselves in this process to legally risky and emotionally draining situations. As she was involved in communication with the family, she expressed doubts about the attitude of organizations and humanitarians and activists, and she referred to problems in determining whether and to what extent something is harmful, despite the initial intentions. She explains how it is difficult to determine the balance, I quote, between those things to which you will say no, because they're extremely harmful, and the things that you will so constantly balanced around that. She continues, a bunch of decisions that we make and which we currently think are useful, they can turn out to be harmful to some extent. So when I asked what her comment was exactly referring to, she explained she was questioning whether, despite their best intentions, they risk causing additional damage to the family, encouraging them to file lawsuits by being in a hyper-precarious position. She also feared that the family was somehow used or instrumentalized, not because of the efforts to condemn the behavior of the Croatian police, of course, but because their tragic situation, it was inevitable, right? Their tragic situation was seen as the perfect case for the advocacy agenda, inevitably contributing to the branding, positioning, and consequently funding of the NGO she was working for. While the traditional face of the humanitarian regime was criticized for victimizing aid recipients and for not addressing the problem of border violence because of the relationship with authorities, etc., the politically more engaged variants of humanitarianism found themselves trapped by and subjected to the same problem within the alliance of neoliberal and migration governance. So Lara explains. There is no answer, no happy middle ground about it. There is a very fine line between what is speaking up and pointing out and that kind of stuff. And then it is precisely this speaking up and the whole public part of the performance around it that is also a fundraising moment, whether you like it or not. It's what you're doing is not feasible. No one will give you money for something. So this contradiction, we might say, to some extent captures Nancy Fraser's argument that there has been a strong tendency under what she calls this last stage financial capitalism to redefine emancipation in market terms, which includes as well social and emancipatory movements, civil society initiatives, etc., all of which inevitably participate in the development of what she defines, I quote, as a progressive neoliberalism that celebrates diversity, meritocracy, emancipation, while dismantling social protection and externalizing social reproduction. So importantly, this also refers to undervaluing socially reproductive activities performed in civil society and humanitarian organizations, of course, by subjecting them to monetization and commodification processes and insisting that they demonstrate their results in quantifiable form, something that is visible, that can be quantified. So, for example, and you know, Lara's frustration and frustration of many workers come from this problem, but yeah, it's not. It doesn't mean always that you know everybody's fully aware of the, you know, structural kind of cause of the problem. But for example, the organization Lara was employed with at the time did not have funding allocated specifically for the purpose of helping people exposed to pushbacks. Working with the Husseini family and working on similar cases was somehow done in addition to her standard job description. So next to being a consequence of the above-mentioned processes, according to Lara, this was also a consequence of the tension perpetuated within the civil society sector. Okay. Now I lost it. Is okay. According to which, being a service provider, so this was a position related to depoliticization and an activist related to depoliticization. Counteracts how this position of service provider counteracts the position of an activist. So according to Lara, this tension prevented some organizations from acknowledging that service provision is necessary for people on the move, and it enables access to people and information at the same time. So as discussed by, for example, P. Lerner in the context of the Black Panthers movement in the 1970s, it also perpetuated the contradictory relationship to state-led social reproduction as something at once desired and contested. So the popular assumption that working in the non-governmental sector is much more than an ordinary job creates an environment that risks the normalization of unpaid overtime, accompanied by an emotional investment that escapes this quantification and involves around relational work, not only with refugees, but also with your colleagues, with other team members. There was a lot of work done in, you know, kind of providing mutual support, conversations, understanding, etc. So Lara says in relation to that, generally, how can you sum up all that emotional work? It's like you cannot use a timer, and you know, how much time you spend thinking about something. You know, sometimes it's just a reply to a message, but it still interrupts somehow your private flow. Very, very shortly, a psychologist, Melita, who worked for humanitarian organizations, emphasized that the high staff turnover in the NGO sector is something everyone counts on because they know burnout will be huge and that people will be coming and leaving their jobs very quickly, precisely because of stress. So she sees the problem in a constant sense of urgency, which implies that everyone should stay at work as long as it takes to complete the project documentation. There are always deadlines. There's always some uncertainty about the funds and etc. So Melita, for example, eventually started insisting on her free time. This would be this radical self-care, and got the support of some managers, and some of them shared their experiences with burnout, but some still considered it very selfish. This is how she describes it. I'm selfish because I take care of myself, but it is a dynamic, and I see it. There's really that part where a lot of things are urgent, but there are those moments when it is really no longer the case, but it's simply something that has become a habit and part of the organizational culture as such. So I will try to conclude with some suggestions, some questions actually. So the image of this moral subject working in stressful environment, together with the implication that NGO work is a lifestyle in which one needs to be always available, strive for self-improvement, etc., affirms this post-Fordist perception of work as a means for self-realization. So the fact that places and relationships that were normally outside of the workplace and traditionally belonged to the area of reproduction became incorporated in and subjected to the business environment, blurred the boundary, as you know, between productive and reproductive or wage and unwaged labor. However, this unpaid, normally reproductive and paid labor is, according to Cathy Weeks, at once necessary to and marginalized by capitalist valorization processes, but also appears as a potential sort of resistance. So according to, for example, Julia Hobart and Tamara Knessi, among probably many others, but this was a book named Radical Care, care contains this radical promise through a non-hierarchical collective work and is intimately connected to modern radical politics and activism. Importantly, most grassroots associations, small-scale NGOs, or these subversive humanitarians, etc., work to, I quote, compensate for the erosion of the welfare state. However, volunteer work, but also these forms of invisible, affective, and emotional labor within a waged position, right, or additional, or etc., has been criticized because it normalizes unpaid labor as, for example, investment in one's future or as a natural part of working in non-profit sector. Besides, this willingness to work unpaid on behalf of others reflects the notion, I quote, of women as endlessly willing to care and sacrifice for others' well-being, regardless of pay or working conditions. So perhaps the quest of all these initiatives, having in mind the problem with depoliticization and pathologization on one hand, and then problems of, these initiatives with a radical potential to get caught in the same number, perhaps a similar struggle. So maybe the quest should be to repoliticize not only the suffering and the migration, but also their own position as workers. And I will conclude by leaving an open question rather than offering a definite answer to a set of problems I don't have an answer to. So how can we think about and articulate, the transformative potential of care that is almost inevitably, why it's almost inevitably exposed to neoliberal cooptation?
Oh, thank you.